Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/212, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or call the voicemail hotline at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 212th edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name is Tim Mooney. Thank you so much for joining me. It feels weird. This is the first time I've been in front of just a microphone, not out in the sticks with a bike and without an interview. It's a kind of old school episode here on this edition. On this episode, we are going to talk about bicycle touring in the age of COVID. It's been a few months now. I think we've gotten some idea of what's going on. I think there's still tons of question marks, but I've gone out on a few tours, and of course I've shared them with you, and I've got some thoughts on this. I've been sort of collecting the positions, the thoughts of some other listeners as well. And I think that I've kind of gotten to the point where I know where I stand on all of this, knowing full well that this isn't the only way to kind of view things. But I thought it would be important at this stage in our coronavirus era to have kind of an episode where I talk about what is bicycle touring in this time. So we will talk about that in this episode. Also, since we're in the housekeeping section, I just didn't say it at the top. Stay tuned for the next tour that I'm going to be on. Kind of a spoiler alert since the topic is talking about touring and COVID, but I am going to continue touring. Is going to be at the end of the show. So stick around for that, and I will talk more about where I'm going, what I'm doing. Another little bit of housekeeping. It seems that bike shortages and maintenance backups are a piece of life right now. So a quick heads up for those of you who are looking to ride, that if you are intending to go to your local bike shop, they are having a tough time, first of all, keeping bikes in stock. So if you are looking to purchase a bike, now this isn't true everywhere, but it seems to be common, make sure you call ahead and know what is in the realm of possible if you're looking to make a new purchase. If you're looking to get your current bike tuned up, fixed up, whatever, whether it's an emergency repair or just maintenance repair, know that some shops are backed up for days and some of them even weeks. My local bike shop here in town that I tend to go to a lot, they actually will close periodically just to do a bit of catch up. So it's kind of good news in a perverse way that these bike shops are having so much business, and I hope it continues, and I hope they're all successful. But for the rest of us, it does mean that we've got to plan ahead. So make sure that you do that. I'm really late to the game for my next topic, and that is the Adventure Cycling podcast, the Dynamo Jenny show. Holy moly, it's pretty good. If you've listened for any length of time to this show, you know that I'm a big booster of women in bike touring. So I want you to definitely go check out that show and give it a real good listen. If you've never heard any of my chats previously on this program with women in bike touring, go check out the interviews with Jasmine Reese, Annalisa Bergh, Adele Dittus, Caperello-Snyder, Kerry Gross. I am missing quite a few people. I know they're all in there. Tons of others. They're all in the back episodes. Please check out those as well. I am being more and more mindful of trying to elevate the voices that folks that don't look like me out there, because I feel like folks like me tend to dominate this type of cycling, and I'd like to see that changed. So let's turn now to talk about bicycle touring in COVID times. And I want to start by laying down some baseline elements here. I'm taking my discussion here very much from a U.S. perspective. Frankly, it's a dumpster fire here compared to other parts of the world in terms of infections. And where you are within the United States, where you are outside of the United States, those conditions may vary quite a bit. So take all of this based on my perspective here in the U.S. From a baseline perspective, I just want to lay down where I'm at on all this. The novel coronavirus is a real threat. It's contagious. We're unsure if if getting it confers any kind of immunity down the line, but we do know that some people can catch it and die. I mean, just straight up die. There's also some open question as to if there are other long-term ramifications from catching COVID. the novel coronavirus and the disease is COVID that comes from it. So even if you personally don't worry about catching the virus, being infected by the virus, and coming down with COVID, know that you can pass it along to people who are way more vulnerable than you. This is not the flu. It is way, way worse. I don't think there's any question that that's sort of the baseline for the discussion with all of this. Life, though, as we all know as bicycle tourists, it's a series of managed risks. Bike touring is a managed risk. If COVID were a purely personal risk that one could choose to take, I think that would make the analysis totally, totally different. However, the fact is that it's totally contagious and other people can catch it. It can be passed on asymptomatically or presymptomatically. And in my opinion, we have a major responsibility to others as well to manage the risk of spread. It's not just our own situation. It does matter for other people as well. I personally have a responsibility to my family. I have responsibility for the people that I come in contact with. You know, that's folks from grocery stores to bike shops to cafes, whatever you name it. On a bike tour, when you're going out there, you're bringing the potential of infection with you, and you may not know it. So again, in my opinion, that means that bicycle touring should be done with more caution than it has before. And frankly, from my perspective, less contact with others than before when we were touring before the outbreaks began. I want to turn a little bit to read a few things from folks that I've been looking at lately. The first is Adventure Cycling Association, and the ACA is pretty clear about what they're saying about their own routes. Here's a quote. At this time, Adventure Cycling Association discourages cyclists from embarking on long-distance bike travel along the adventure cycling route network. We believe the bicycle traveling community has a responsibility to avoid endangering the health of small communities and straining limited medical resources. Moreover, shelter-in-place and quarantine orders exist at many levels of government across our network, and availability of services is inconsistent and unpredictable. We can't say for certain when it will be safe to take long tours again. But at this time, we've canceled our own guided tours through September 5th and are evaluating on an ongoing basis beyond that date. In the meantime, Adventure Cycling is hard at work to improve bicycle travel conditions, develop new routes for future adventures, and make sure we're ready to help you when it's time to hit the road once again. Okay, so that's ACA. And notice what they're saying. I mean, not to get all lawyerly on this. They're not saying don't get out and bike tour, but what they're saying is don't do long distance bike tour. And I think they lay a really good argument in that. That's part of sort of where my headspace is on all of this. I wanted to also share from a couple of listeners who wrote in, because I invited some folks to call in or write in. And I got two that I'd like to share. First is from a listener in Oklahoma, and this is Martin. And this is a little bit on the longer side, but I think it's worth reading this whole thing so that you've got the whole context. So Martin writes, for context, I live in rural northeast Oklahoma. We have a low population density. However, many residents are at best inconsistent about protective behaviors. Also relevant is that I have a family member with a mild to moderately compromised immune system. In late May, I prepared a 200-mile, 4 to 6 day loop tour through rural backroads. I designed the route so that campgrounds were available every 40 to 60 miles. And so with natural water sources, I could filter to minimize reliance on in-town resupply stops. Halfway through the route, I had the option and risk of a hotel to cool off from the heat. I ended up canceling my plans when Oklahoma's COVID surge took off in June. As I've considered why I canceled this tour, I realized that the presence of COVID alters my risk assessment of other tour variables, mostly by making my typical bailout options potentially unsafe for me, my family, or my helper/rescuer. For this tour, the most likely potential problem was heat exhaustion, 95-degree highs and 65% humidity. In a COVID world, I don't want to cool off inside high-traffic buildings like gas stations, especially in a region where mask wearing is not the majority practice. And of course, if I get heat stroke, I could end up in an emergency room where there's liable to be a greater presence of coronavirus. In my mind, COVID amplifies the potential consequences of the risks already present on a bike tour. What does this look like for me going forward? Probably S240s and a few, if any, multi-night tours. I've begun pinpointing primitive open camping locations within 40 to 60 mile radius, mostly wildlife conservation areas and designated fishing lakes. Typically, there are no facilities or campgrounds as such, and thus very low traffic. While I might consider a small state park, I'm not comfortable chancing a crowded check-in lobby. With luck, I can string together a 2-night mini tour of no-contact campsites. As long as the riding and weather aren't too demanding, I'd be willing to do that sort of tour. Also, no more tours without a family member on standby, ready to pick me up if need be. No relying on the kindness of strangers for enough aid to get me back on the road. And then he goes on saying he's interested in hearing what other folks have to say about it. I think it's a really, really interesting bit of analysis that he put into it. Greg Braithwaite, who you of course know from the show, he's a friend of the show, Pedalshift Society member. Greg writes, "What I've personally settled into is several one-day trips that include one-stop max at some kind of supply or food store. Use of disinfecting wipes, hand sanitizer, masks. No weekend overnights to avoid crowds. Repeated trips to a destination on the coast that is a proven stealth spot, but modifying my route to get there. For me, this is often 80 to 120 miles round trip." What didn't work was when our California state parks opened, and I assumed that include hiker-biker sites. It does not. It's unclear from the website, and I should have called before riding out to Half Moon Bay from Santa Cruz. This mistake caused me to stay in a hotel, very clean, very safe, but not something I'd necessarily sign up for during COVID. And a quick shout out, Greg's got a brand new YouTube channel called Bike Vids. Go check it out. I got the link in the show notes. It's really great. All right, so these are similar. I feel like that there's some degree of consensus amongst at least the folks that I've been talking to. I think Adventure Cycling Association as well, about where we are on bicycle touring. And so I've got kind of a list of recommendations that I've developed. It's very much consistent with the practice that I've had, and I think consistent with what everybody that I've been talking to has been mentioning. I will say that I've seen on some message boards in a variety of places that there are folks that take a very careful approach to things and suggest, like what Adventure Cycling said, is that if you are out there and you get into some kind of an accident or you are bringing COVID with you, you are putting a strain on rural medical systems. And I think that that is a compelling argument for those that would say, hey, no bike touring during this time. I think it's compelling. For me, however, I think that I have landed on the side of saying that there are ways to manage your risks. And I think, like Martin does, to have a bailout option that does not rely on the community that you're in, but rather on somebody that's on call. I think that that's a pretty good idea. So here's what I'm recommending in the US and potentially elsewhere. Again, this is all from a U.S. perspective. We are in dire straits compared to other parts of the world. I do not need to tell you if you've been paying attention to any of the news and any of the math. This is all very data driven. So first things first, you should only tour in a responsible way. Every single route that you are considering doing is going to be there after all of this is over. So if you were, thinking about doing the Pacific Coast, the whole Pacific Coast of the U.S., or the Trans Am, or anything along those lines, those routes are going to be there. They're going to be there next year. They're going to be there the year after. It may be a few years until we can really, truly, comfortably, and responsibly do these longer routes over a long period of time, which isn't to say that people aren't doing them right now. They are. I've seen it. But I think that the responsible thing, given everything that we've looked at, is to consider something different. And that is shorter, local, low, or preferably no contact tours. All of those things. That's how I'm approaching things, at least for the near future. I'm also avoiding all forms of public transportation for now, and that includes buses, trains, and planes. And as you all know, I am a huge proponent of public transportation and a huge user of public transportation in my bike tours, for fast forwards and a whole bunch of other things. I'm going to be avoiding that now. I mean, I think I won't say never. If it was an emergency situation and my other options were not available, maybe. But for now, I'm making all plans and all contingencies to avoid using public transportation. Like some of the folks that I read earlier, I'm looking at limiting resupplies and limiting contact in towns to only the necessary types of interactions that are possible there. When I am in town, in fact, well, let me back up. I intend to mask up, and I shouldn't say intend. I have been masking up as much as possible. And that includes when I'm riding, but most especially when other folks are around. That is 100% when I'm in other communities. And it is also in campgrounds when there are other people that are going to be around. I have not, to this point, since this all began, been in a campground with another person. I suspect that in my next trip that it's entirely likely that I will, and masking is going to be a big part of it. Don't want to get into the whole thing about masks, but just freaking wear a mask, okay? Solo travel. You all know that I tend to prefer solo travel. I think in the current conditions, solo travel is ideal. I was in Hancock the other day, and there was a small group of people who clearly weren't from the same family, clearly weren't from the same bubble, and they were traveling together. And of course, they weren't masked up and whatnot. And that's just not my choice. But I think that when you are merging your bubbles together, you're taking a risk. You're adding risk, perhaps needlessly, to you, to others, and it's not a choice that I would make. So I would say solo travel is ideal. Your next best option is touring within your bubble. Travel with your partner. If your partner and you are bike tourists, great, go do it together. That's the next best. The last best is touring with others. But I would say you should remain socially distanced. I did not see that with this particular group. I think social distancing and masking is the two most important ways that we can to avoid passing on infection. And I would encourage everyone to do that in any bicycle tour that you do. So again, first choice, solo. Second choice, touring only with folks in your bubble. Third choice, last, it would be touring with others, but remaining socially distant. I think also an incredibly important piece to any bike touring that you're doing, and certainly what I've been doing, is maximize your hygiene when you're on tour. Now, I'm not talking about making sure you're showering every day, although that would be pretty good too. It's probably not going to be as possible with a lot of the types of tours that people are going to be taking advantage of. A lot of solo, a lot of stealth camping and whatnot. But definitely make sure that after you come in contact with any place public, any public restrooms, any facilities, any shops, any stores, that you are doing what they keep saying. Wash those hands, use the hand sanitizer. Really make sure that you are minimizing the chance of any kind of transmission possible. Camping, I think, is probably the safest situation in terms of your overnight lodging, to the extent you're doing overnights. It's lower contact in most instances, except of course when it's not. So, not all campsites are going to be the same. Not all camping facilities are going to be the same. Be mindful of that before you go in. I would say, planning more, being more of a planner, especially when it comes to your lodging, is probably a better idea during all of this. A, because you don't know what's going to be open. B, so that you can know what your expectation should be in terms of exposure, sanitation, hygiene, etc. during all of this. I don't think that Airbnbs or hotels are necessarily unsafe. I think it really depends on the circumstances. Greg talked about the hotel that he stayed at near Half Moon Bay not being necessarily something that he was concerned about. You can all do your own research on whether or not we should be as afraid about surfaces compared to airborne transmission. I'm not going to play doctor on this podcast by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that some places are going to be better than others. Make sure you do your research and, treat that space accordingly. Does that mean wiping it down? Is that where your headspace is at? Sure. Consider that as part of how you approach things. Less proximity to people is the most preferable. That's why I've been traveling alone. That's why I've been minimizing contact. That's why I've been not going into towns as much as I normally do. The more that you stay alone, the more that you stay separate, the better when all is said and done. Frankly, for me, that's what I do this for sometimes. So to me, it is no skin off my back at all to stay further away from folks. What I haven't had is a situation where sometimes I'm in camp and I'm generally quite social in camp. And some of my best interactions have come in camp. And now, while I still intend to have those interactions, should they be there, they're going to be 10 feet away. And I just think that that's the best way to approach it for me. I think this should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. If you're showing any symptoms of COVID, you need to bail out of your trip right away. Whatever your contingency plan is, if you're starting to go fevery, if you're starting to have that cough, all of the symptoms that we've been talking about for months now, end your tour. I don't think that there is any way to put this more bluntly. Your tour should end. You are putting yourself at risk, of course, from a health perspective, but you are absolutely also putting others at risk as well. So end your tour, bail out as quickly and safely as you can and as responsibly as possible. Do not get on public transit. That's all I'm saying. A day trip loop that starts and ends at your home is a fine replacement in these times for a bicycle tour. I'll say that one more time. Set up your tent in your backyard. Do 4 days of loops that begin and end at your home. That is an awesome bicycle tour, especially during these times. It's a fine trip. And you know what? If you don't want to camp, guess what? You got your bed at your house too. Day trip loops are a really, really good idea for folks where that's your only option available. Do it. It's good for you. Get out and bike. Do it in a safe way. It can be a good replacement. So I've been getting some questions from folks who are outside of the United States asking, hey, are people touring in the US? As I've mentioned, yeah, it's hard for me to assess because I have not been more than 100 miles away from where I'm standing right now in months. So I don't know what it's like really outside of this area. I don't know if it's the same, more or less than in any given year. But yeah, I'm touring, obviously. It's been really helpful for my mental health, and I think it's a nice getaway from whatever this new normal is. And I would say if you follow the types of recommendations that I'm giving you, I'm not saying that my way is the only way. It certainly is not. But that's what I am doing. That's how I'm approaching things. I think that touring is possible. I think it's possible to do it in a good, sound, safe, responsible way. And as I talked about at the top of the show, I take this responsibility very seriously. I would feel devastated if I did something where I know that I passed along an infection to somebody, especially with compromised immune systems. And I had a way to prevent that. So that's how I'm approaching my everyday life, but that's particularly true on how I'm approaching bicycle touring. But it's important to me, and it's important to get out, and that's why I'm continuing to do it. Manage risk. That's kind of the name of the game. So, given all of that, I am going to go out on another tour. And because I know that you all must be tired of hearing about me going on the C&O yet again, I have determined and I have figured out a way for me to do a trip on an entirely different route than the C&O for my next tour, because I'm going to, of course, be sharing this as part of a Pedalshift Tour Journals. It's going to occupy a good chunk of August, if not all of August. So I'm going to be following my own recommendations. First, I'm going to be keeping it local-ish. It begins and ends 1 hour drive from my cabin in West Virginia. I'm going to be dropped off and picked up from the same spot by my partner. Thank you, Kimberly. It's going to be all camping, potentially with some stealth camping, specifically to reduce contact even more than if I was in designated campsites. It's going to be solo, which is sort of what I do, but I think solo touring is preferable these days from a COVID perspective. It's going to be self-contained with one resupply point midway in this tour, water notwithstanding. I will be stopping for water resupplies at different spots, and that's actually one of the question marks that I've got on this tour, because where I'm going to be going, water is not as plentiful as in other spots. So to be continued on that. I will be masking, obviously. I will be carrying a ton of sanitizer. I'm going to be treating my interactions so that if I were infected, that it's far less likely that I'd be bringing it to anyone, and that I'm minimizing my own exposure in case someone around me is infected. That's basically how I've been living my life for the last several months, but it's particularly conscious with how I'm designing this tour. So, where do you think this is? You do not have to wait. I will tell you right now. It's a tour of the Great Allegheny Passage. And it is going to be, this is the fun part. As I was trying to figure out how to make this all work, I realized if I wanted to not use public transit, because as you all know, I tend to use the Amtrak whenever I'm doing something to do with the Gap. I've also rented cars before, and I just didn't want to do that. Well, luckily, my partner is available and happily will drive a full hour to drop me off and a full hour to come back, and do it the same when I come back. I'm going to be starting and ending in Cumberland, Maryland, which is the end of the Great Allegheny Passage. And I'm going to be going from Cumberland to Connellsville and back. So I will be doing a good chunk of the route. It'll be about half of the trail. It's a little bit less than that. Connellsville is at mile marker 88 on a 150-mile trail of the Great Allegheny Passage. Now, the interesting thing about all this, and the reason why I got so excited when the math worked out this way, I'm going to be doing this in 4 days. And what's fun is 4 days, averaging or even hitting, because there is a campground that I'm eyeing at mile marker 44. It is And by the way, go orange, but I didn't plan it. For those of you who know, 44 is a big number for my alma mater, Syracuse University. So I am calling this the Gap 4x44 loop. I'm kind of excited about that element of it. I know that I will be averaging 44 miles because I may or may not hit that campground that's at mile marker 44 that I often target. There may be some wild camping. I may go a little bit further, but the average each day, 44 miles, 4 days, 4x44. I love it. I'm so excited. I'm really excited to get back on the Gap. Incredible trail. Really looking forward to doing the Gap in both directions on this trip. There's a big question as to which way do you prefer more. I tend to prefer it on the outbound route that I'm doing. That'll be going towards Pittsburgh. But the best part is I'll slog up that hill on my first day, and on the fourth day when I come back I'll be zooming down it, so I get the best of all worlds. I will be earning that fourth day downhill, which I'm very excited about. So that is the new tour. Look for that in August. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours like the Kessel Run. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the Society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadis, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Stuart Buchan, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Dan Gebhardt, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Biggle, Greg Middlemas, Connie Moore, William Goffman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latois Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Tom Bilch, Ronald Piroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Grotke, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lecko, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCulloch, John Hickman, Jack Smith, Carl Presso, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, and new to the Society, Dave Fletcher, James Stratakis, and David Neves. And thanks to all past and anonymous members for making this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.